Every investigation begins the same. A name, a file, a story waiting to be told. But every file begins with a life. I'm Rietta, and this is the Black File Project. File 001, Chapter 4. So for the last few chapters, we spent a lot of time in courtrooms and reading over custody orders and police reports, looking into lawsuits and all sorts of criminal filings. We've talked about relationships that existed before Heather and all the events that occurred, and at first glance seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with her death. But I think after you've listened to the last 3 episodes, that's probably changed. At least I hope it has. And there's a reason for that. You know, when Heather and Andy began their relationship, neither one of them were entering it without a history. I mean, no one is, right? Anytime we go into any sort of relationship, there's always a history. But in this particular case, we need to understand the history before we can understand what happened. But today, I want to go back to Heather. And this time, we're not going to learn about her marriage exclusively through just like court records and all that. We're going to kind of watch it as an outsider because Heather and Andy shared a lot of their lives online. This first video, which I unfortunately don't have a copy of, it used to be on Heather's Facebook. But I think just describing it to you should give you a sense of kind of what was happening. But in November of 2015, Andy posted a video to Facebook, and he called it a prank on Heather. And he made it appear that someone had broken into their home. And then he waited for Heather to come home and come inside. Once she was inside, he grabbed her from behind in the dark. And you can probably imagine what Heather's reaction was to this so-called prank. And I didn't get to watch it a ton because the video, as far as I know, doesn't exist anymore. But I've watched the video and reacted to it, much like I wish I could do for you, because you know that I like to show visuals because I've done that so far. But it's very uncomfortable to watch. I obviously can't tell you what Heather was thinking or feeling in that moment because I can't. I don't possess that ability. But I can tell you this wasn't a video somebody secretly recorded and posted. This was something they were willing to share publicly as part of their life together. And that distinction becomes important because as I continue going through their social media, I found other things. Heather and Andy weren't only sharing funny videos or pieces of their everyday lives, they were preparing to share their marriage with people in a much bigger way. And that turned into what they called couples coffee time. Now, this probably sounds very normal, right? Heather and Andy decided they wanted to go live together to announce that they've been discussing for a while that they wanted to start a Christian ministry centered around marriage and family. And Andy explains that the idea came partly from their own experiences, from raising 4 children, managing work, sports, travel, and just a blended family. And then, of course, their marriage. But he said something that immediately caught my attention. He says, people regularly contacted them asking how they managed to have such a happy marriage. And apparently, someone had another question. Was the marriage they saw actually real? Or were Heather and Andy, as Andy put it, just married on Facebook? And I'm going to go ahead and play that clip for you so you can see it.
So we're getting about 5 to 6, sometimes some weeks a lot more, just messages on our Facebook and emails and texts saying, how in the world do y'all have this happy marriage? Is it real? Or is it you just married on Facebook?
And that's how Andy and Heather were presenting their marriage at that point. Not just as happy, as some other people apparently looked at and wanted to understand. They believed their experiences could help other couples. And I want to make something really clear before we go any further. I'm not showing you this because I think every happy moment between Heather and Andy was fake. I don't know that. Neither do you. Relationships aren't that simple. People can love each other and still have problems. They can be laughing on Monday and have a horrible argument on Friday. They can also have generally happy years and incredibly painful ones. And knowing how Heather's story ends doesn't give us the right to go backwards and erase every good moment or memory that did come before it. So throughout this chapter, I'm just going to show you what existed at the time, and I'm going to let Heather and Andy speak for themselves whenever they can. There are generally a lot of light moments in this whole video. They joke with each other. Heather talks about loving animals, while Andy says he doesn't. Andy jokes that because Heather likes animals, they have animals. So, he became willing to do it because it was something that Heather enjoyed. He talks about watching The Bachelor with her because she enjoys it. They talk about getting up before the kids in the morning and having coffee time together, quiet time together. They talk about their goals for the day, what they're struggling with, things they're frustrated about. Andy described their home as a haven, which I feel that too. My home is absolutely my haven, my safe place. He talks about Heather squeezing his hand 3 times when they're driving as a silent way of saying, I love you. Those are all real moments, whether we want to admit that or not. And I think it's important that because this live stream wasn't 25 minutes of 2 people appearing miserable. There are moments where they joke. There are moments when they laugh. And there are moments that look mundane, everyday interactions of a married couple. And then there are moments that hit a little differently. So I'm going to play this next section for you, and then we're going to talk about it.
It's called leftovers because I don't like leftovers. I don't eat leftovers. Food is not good leftover. You may like it, but I don't. Heather likes leftovers. Food is delicious when it's first cooked. And when it comes out and it's delicious and it's hot, it's perfect then. 2 or 3 days later, it is...
What a microwave is for.
Awful. So I'm not a fan of leftovers, but she'll eat that. And the reason why I don't like it is because it's lost its original flavor. As it said, it's got stale and hard and cold. Well, our relationships do the same thing. When we first meet somebody, when I first saw Heather, I thought, God, she's hot, she's beautiful, and everything she says is funny. But then there's some days that it's not funny.
I'm always funny.
And some days that you pass each other in the hallway, you're like, oh my God,
You don't ever think that.
I don't want to live in the house
that.
with you either. And relationships get like that food. It gets left over. It gets moldy. It's not hot and steamy anymore. So how do you fix that?
All right. So obviously the topic here was comparing relationships to leftovers. So the idea is that relationships can become like leftover food. Something that was once hot and fresh can become stale, cold, mundane. And while he's explaining it, he starts joking about Andy and Heather's marriage. And at one point, he talks about those days when you pass your spouse in the hallway and think, oh my God. And Heather immediately interrupts him and she tells him, don't even think about that. There's banter, there's teasing, Heather is pushing back. And I actually really like being able to show you this because we've spent so much time reading other people's descriptions of these two. Here you can just simply watch them interact. But near the end of the live stream, Heather says something I think we need to hear in her own voice. They're talking about wanting the ministry to be authentic. Heather says they're not going to get online every day and pretend that their lives are perfect. Here is the clip of her talking about that.
No, and I just want to say too before we go, we just want to keep it real. Like, we're not going to get on here every day and pretend that everything is all sunshine and rainbows and butterflies, because it's not. Everybody has something that they struggle with, and everybody has a bad day every now and then.
I'm not going to interpret that conversation for you. You could clearly hear what Heather said. You can clearly hear what Andy said. You've just watched it yourself. And at the time of this live stream, they were talking about marriage publicly. They were planning a whole ministry around it. They were telling people how they made the relationship work. And they were also acknowledging when they did fight, according to Heather, they went big. Remember that. Not because I'm telling you what it means, but because later in the story, Heather is going to describe some of their arguments herself. And when she does, we won't be watching her face anymore and trying to guess what she's feeling. We'll just have her words. I have a lot of my own feelings and interpretations of this whole interaction. I personally think during this interaction as well, and y'all can obviously have your own opinions, I feel like a lot of the time she looks uncomfortable. Again, I don't know how she truly felt or what was truly going through her mind, but to me, she looks uncomfortable. And that's not the first time, because like I said in the prank video, it was very uncomfortable to watch, which is why I talked about that first. It wasn't the first time that I've seen Heather be uncomfortable. And if you remember that video of her singing in church, she looked very comfortable there, very confident, very beautiful, and just sharing. That I did not see the same woman there. But that is just my personal opinion. We're all going to have our own opinions on how this interaction appears. The only two people that know what was actually going on were Andy and Heather. I just wanted to provide some older visuals of Andy and Heather. And while Andy and Heather were publicly talking about family and marriage in their blended home, another custody battle involving Andy's children was reaching a critical point. On February 26th of 2016, a court issued a temporary order involving Andy's three sons and again their mother, Mendy. And this document takes us back to something we already encountered in this file: parental alienation. The court order temporarily awarded Mendy sole custody of the three boys. And according to the order, the court found that Andy's efforts to alienate the children from their mother had caused them psychological harm. Think about that for a second. Their own father had caused not one, not two, but all three of the boys psychological harm. The order also described Andy as creating what the court called unnecessary conflict and discord in the children's lives. And this wasn't solely based on Mendy making accusations. According to the order, the guardian ad litem and a child psychologist had testified about what they were seeing. The court described the circumstances as one of the most egregious cases of parental alienation they had ever encountered. That is huge, if you ask me. That's not just simple parents just not getting along. We are now causing potential permanent damage to these children. And the remedy the court ordered was significant. Andy wasn't simply told to stop discussing Mendy with the children. Both Andy and the children were ordered into therapy. For 3 weeks, Andy was to have no contact with his sons. And if you remember from a couple episodes ago, this was not the first time that Andy was ordered to have no contact, except with Heather's son. So now he's ordered to have no contact with his own three sons. And then after that, contact wasn't simply going to be returned to normal. It was to be phased back in and initially supervised by a therapist. And I want to stop here because there's an important distinction between what we're discussing now and something we've discussed previously. This is a court order. I'm showing you what the court itself found and what the court ordered. There are other records connected to this custody litigation that we're not using. We don't need them. This order tells us what the judge ultimately decided at this stage. And by February of 2016, the court believed the situation had become serious enough that separating Andy from his sons completely for a period of time was necessary. Think about the contrast between the two things we've just seen. On social media, Heather and Andy are talking about their blended family. And Andy talks about how much his boys love Heather. They talk about children and marriage and how families can survive conflict. Yet in family court, a judge is simultaneously dealing with a conflict involving those same children that the court believed had caused psychological harm. Again, one doesn't mean the other was fake. That's not what I'm saying. It means the public version of someone's life is rarely the entire version. And that's something we're going to see more and more as we get closer to 2017. The pressure also wasn't only coming from family court. 1 month later, Andy would file for bankruptcy again, this time Chapter 13. According to the file, Andy estimated his liabilities somewhere between $100,000 and $500,000. And among the people listed as being owed money was Mendy. More than $32,000. Now remember where we just came from in Chapter 3. The Chattahoochee River Country Music Festival had collapsed the previous summer. Businesses claimed they hadn't been paid. Lawsuits quickly filed. Atlanta Beverage Company was seeking hundreds of thousands of dollars. A graphic designer had sued Andy and Celeb Scene over the festival logo. And now, in March of 2016, we have another bankruptcy filing. I'm not telling you every one of those things caused the other. The records don't allow me to make that leap. I'm showing you the chronological order of how these things are unfolding. Because this was the landscape surrounding Heather and Turner's life in 2016. Again, we're back in court. There's therapy orders. There's financial problems. More lawsuits. And at the same time, life kept moving. Heather kept moving. And that summer, she started a new job. Sometime around June or July of 2016, Heather began working at the Paulding County Probate Court, and working there with her was a man named Robb. He had already been there for approximately 2 years when Heather arrived. At first, they were coworkers, and eventually they were friends. Nothing about that sounds particularly remarkable. People all start new jobs all the time. They meet people, they make friends because they spend a lot of time with the people that they work with. But Robb is going to become extremely important to this story, not because of something investigators would discover years later, and not because someone reconstructed their relationship after Heather died, but because as Heather entered the final months of her life, she began talking to Robb and eventually writing to him a lot. And those writings still exist. And when we get there, you're going to hear Heather describe her life in her own words. But we're not there quite yet. Because first, we need to understand how Robb became someone Heather trusted enough to tell those things to. And that is where we're going to go next. So we already established that Robb and Heather really got to know each other, and over time their friendship became very important to Heather. And I think this is really worth establishing now, because later when we start reading Heather's emails, you're going to see a level of trust between these two that didn't appear overnight. By April of 2017, Heather was telling Robb extremely personal things. What she said was happening inside of her marriage. She was talking about leaving. She was talking about her future, which is very important, in my opinion. She was talking about fear. And she was talking about love. But those conversations don't make nearly as much sense if I introduce Robb 5 minutes before I start reading them. He had already been a part of Heather's everyday for months. And importantly, he was part of a life Heather had outside of her home. She went to work. She had coworkers. She had relationships with people there. Not just Robb. There was a judge there who knew her very well. There were law enforcement officers working the building. And eventually some of those people would become aware that something was happening in Heather's personal life. But in the summer of 2016, we aren't there just yet. Now, while Heather was beginning this new part of her life, some of the old problems surrounding Andy were still playing out. So remember the logo that we talked about in the last chapter and that I just mentioned briefly? That logo was created by a graphic designer named James Curtis. Curtis had sued Andy and Celeb Scene in federal court over work connected to that logo and the Chattahoochee River Music Festival. That case didn't just disappear when the festival ended. So on July 22nd, 2016, a federal judge entered a default judgment in Curtis's favor, and Celeb Scene was ordered to pay him $45,500. I'm not going to take you back through the whole entire lawsuit because we did that already. You know what the festival was. You know how it ended. You know that business and vendors said they were owed money and that this was not the only lawsuit that was filed. What I want you to see here is that those consequences were still unfolding years later. And remember, only a few months before this judgment, Andy had filed Chapter 13 bankruptcy, listing somewhere between that $100,000 and $500,000 in estimated liabilities. So while Heather was starting a new job, the legal and financial issues we've been following hadn't simply gone away. They were continuing in the background. And then we get to the end of 2016, and this is where Heather's story begins to change. According to Robb, before he left work for the holiday break in December, he and Heather were together in the parking lot. They hugged. Now, normally I wouldn't spend too much time telling you two workers hugged in a parking lot, but Robb remembered this hug differently. He described it as a longer than what he considered a hug between friends. And during this period, according to Robb, Heather told him something we've already touched on earlier in this series. She told him that she and Andy weren't legally married. And she said the reason involved forgery. Now, if you've been with me from the beginning, this isn't the first time you've heard me raise questions about Heather and Andy's marriage record. I've told you there are issues surrounding whether this marriage was legally valid. But this adds an important piece to that story because we're not talking about somebody looking at these records after Heather died and deciding something looks strange. According to Robb, Heather was saying it herself while she was alive in December of 2016. So she was telling somebody that she trusted that she did not believe that she and Andy were legally married because of what she described as a forgery. That's significant, but I don't want to get ahead of the evidence. Heather saying there was a forgery tells us what Heather was saying and apparently believed. It does not by itself establish who forged something, exactly what was forged, or every legal implication of it. There are records connected to this, and we will deal with those records. But right now, I'm interested in Heather because think about where we started this chapter. Earlier, you watched Heather sitting next to Andy talking publicly about their marriage. You heard Andy say people asked whether their happy marriage was real or whether it was simply married on Facebook. And you heard Heather say, but we do really like each other. You heard them talk about coffee in the morning, their children, their home, trying to make time for each other. You also heard Heather acknowledge that things weren't always sunshine and rainbows and say that she and Andy fought. And when they fought, they went big. And now, by December of 2016, according to Robb, Heather was privately telling him that she did not believe the marriage was even legally valid. Now, those two things can exist in the same story. You don't have to decide that one was true and the other was false. Relationships change, people change, circumstances change, and we don't know everything that happened between those moments. That's exactly why I'm not going to take footage from one day and use it to tell what Heather must have felt every other day of their marriage. But something was changing because, according to Robb, after that December interaction, their relationship changed too. They became, in his words, much more affectionate. But according to Robb, they continued to see each other only at work. And I think we need to talk about that because I don't want to sanitize Heather's story. I also don't want to sensationalize it. Heather was married, or at the very least publicly living as Andy's wife, while developing feelings for another man. That is part of this record. And if we're going to tell Heather's story, like I've already said in previous episodes, we're going to do so honestly. What we don't do is turn that into some cheap affair storyline. Because once we have Heather's own writings, the picture becomes considerably more complicated. As I've already stated, I have Heather and Robb's correspondence, not someone's recollection of what Heather might have said, not a summary written years later. Heather's words, Robb's responses, conversations that were happening in real time. And I'm telling you that now because eventually Robb isn't going to be the person telling us what Heather thought. Heather is. And that's going to matter a lot. But before we get there, there's another piece of the timeline we need to establish because while Heather's relationship with Robb was changing, the custody battle involving Andy's sons wasn't finished either. On March 14th of 2017, Andy and Mendy's eldest son signed an affidavit requesting that Andy become his primary physical custodian. Now, I want to be careful about how much meaning we assign to this document. Andy's son was expressing his own wishes. That's what the affidavit established. And that's important because if you've been following this file, you know that just a year earlier, the court had temporarily placed the boys with Mendy and ordered Andy to have no contact with them for 3 weeks and required therapy before contact was gradually reintroduced. Now, the eldest son was asking the court to live primarily with his father. I'm including this because I don't want to selectively show you only the documents that point in one direction. This document is part of this file. It fits in with the current timeline that we're in, so you get to see it. That's part of opening the file. Sometimes a document supports what you thought you understood. Sometimes it complicates it. And sometimes it raises other questions. But I'm not going to hide anything because it doesn't fit neatly into a certain narrative. Now look at where we are. We're approaching the spring of 2017. Heather has been working at the probate court for months. According to Robb, their friendship has become more affectionate. Heather has told him she doesn't believe her marriage to Andy is legally valid. The custody litigation involving Andy's sons is continuing. And there are only a few weeks remaining before May 4th. This is the point where their records begin coming closer together. Until now, we've had separate lanes, family court here, financial problems here, Heather and Andy's public life. But in April, those lanes are all going to start intersecting, and they start intersecting quickly. Before we go there, though, I want you to remember the Heather you saw at the beginning of this chapter. Not Heather Turner as the name on a police report, not Heather as the woman whose death we eventually are going to investigate. Heather sitting with a cup of coffee, joking, interrupting Andy, saying their relationship wasn't always sunshine and rainbows, because the next records we're going to examine are different from almost everything we've gone through so far. For most of the file, other people have been doing the talking. Judges, deputies, attorneys, journalists, now Robb. But beginning in April of 2017, Heather starts leaving us a record herself. And if you remember in the first episode, I talked about Heather being a writer. She loved being a writer. She was a very passionate writer. She loved to put words on paper. It's how she expressed herself. And the first email we're going to examine was written on April 4th of 2017. So that is exactly a month before. That morning, according to Heather, Andy came to her workplace and he brought Lexi with him. What happened next would spill from Heather's office into their home and eventually into an email Heather sent to Robb. And for the first time in their story, we're going to hear Heather describe what she says happened behind closed doors. We're going to stop right there because I don't want to do what would be very easy to do with this case. I don't want to race towards Heather's death simply because we know it's coming. There are 30 days now left between April 4th and May 4th. And Heather left way too much behind for me to reduce those 30 days to an end of an episode. Like I already said, we have her emails, we have letters, we have a ton of police records, and we have people who were around her. We have things Heather said she was planning to do. And for the first time since we opened File 001, we have something we desperately needed: Heather's perspective. So April 4th isn't the end of this chapter. It is the beginning of the next one. There's one last thing I want to say before we close this chapter. Heather's relationship with Robb is going to become a part of the story. There's not really a way to avoid that, and I don't intend to. But I'm also not interested in putting Heather on trial for developing feelings for someone else. That's not the purpose of this. We're not interested in the relationship because Heather was talking to Robb. She trusted him with information about her life. And eventually she told him things about what she said was happening inside her home. That makes their correspondence evidence of Heather's state of mind and her account of events at the time. It doesn't mean everything Heather said automatically becomes independently proven fact. That's an important distinction. When Heather describes something only she and Andy were present for, I'll tell you, Heather said this happened. When another record corroborates some part of that timeline, I'll show you the record. When something is Robb's recollection, I'll tell you it's Robb's recollection. And when I don't know something, I'm going to tell you I don't know. That's how we've handled this file from the beginning, and that's how we're going to handle it for what comes next. Because something happens when you spend enough time inside a case file. The person at the center of it can start disappearing, and Heather becomes just a date. And I don't want that to happen here. Because like I've said before May 4th of 2017, Heather was living her life. She had started a new job. She had people around her. She was grieving people she'd lost. She was forming a new relationship. She was making plans. And one of the most important factors, I think, is that she was making a future. She was thinking about the future. And she wrote a lot of those thoughts down. And that's where we're going to go next. Not just straight to May 4th. Not yet. We're going to spend the month of April with Heather. I'm Rietta, and this is the Black File Project. Thank you for opening the file with me. I'll see you next chapter.